Hello, everyone. Good evening if you're in a similar time zone than I am. Good morning, probably. Good afternoon for many others out there. And thank you so much, Dan McAdams, for this wonderful talk and for being here with us to discuss. I would like to remind our participants to send in questions. So please use the Q&A tool on the bottom of the screen to send in your questions. Hello, Dan. Our participants are coming in and questions are coming in. And while the questions will be coming in, it is my privilege to ask the first one. So Camus' Plague is one of the novels that seem so relevant these days, right? And often, at least this is my impression, we stop at the point where we are simply thinking, now we are facing exactly the same Camus described, and it is the same for the people in the novel back then than it is for us right now. We are on lockdown. And what I particularly appreciate is you going beyond this and actually contextualizing the story and focusing on the tremendous insight in self and personal development and connecting it also to wisdom theories. And I was thinking the change in Raymond, the journalist, who is kind of thrown into living in a city he can't escape, although trying to eventually recognizing he doesn't want to pursue merely private happiness, right? So I was asking myself, how far does common decency go in the time of COVID-19? And we heard about the first French doctors who died from the virus since they agreed to come back from retirement to help out, just to help out. And when we look at wisdom theories that focus on balancing individual needs and striving for a common good, shouldn't we be learning something due to the lockdown? I remember in Germany, like so many thoughts coming up. I remember in Germany, it took weeks until the supply chains for toilet paper recovered from a wave of stockpiling in the first few days of the lockdown, like just a couple of days. And 2 months ago, we extensively debated that buying high-tech face masks for daily use might affect the availability of this gear for first responders, right, and medical professionals. So the ego versus the greater good or the common good, while at the same time social distancing. And now finally my question, what has changed since Camus' Plague 1947?
That's a good question. I mean, the folks in the novel they're completely locked down and they can't get out at all and they have no communication with the outside world. So in many ways, their situation is way worse than what we face today. I think, I don't know really what has changed, but when I hear you talking about some of the other characters in the novel, in particular the journalists and so forth, I think that a crisis brings out things in people that we just didn't know were there all along. I don't know if it reveals the true self, or maybe it just reveals a different self, but I think everybody responds to it differently, and there's a sort of unpredictability about that. I know in the novel, one of the characters early on tries to kill himself. This is before the virus, before the epidemic, and then once everybody around him is inflicted with this disease, he finds new meaning for living, and he continues to. But then when it ends, he no longer has any meaning. And I think he actually does end up killing himself. So, I mean, it's just hard to know how people will react individually to this sort of crisis. Here in the US, I mean, everybody's reacting differently, and it's so early, it's hard to know how it's going to play out.
Mm-hmm. Robert is asking a question. He says, I found your notion of episodic subjectivity is very interesting. What are the implications of the electorate voting for an episodic subject? What does that say about your current conceptions of time in the US political sphere?
Well, the episodic man, and in this case, I use Donald Trump as an example, I mean, lives for the moment, and it's always about the short term. And so I think, unfortunately, at least in the 2016 election here in the United States, there was a lot of concern about, what's going on in the moment, not any kind of long-term idea here. And so Mr. Trump, as the episodic man, actually turns out to be extraordinarily entertaining and enervating and charismatic for many people who know that he lives in the moment and he's vibrant and powerful in the moment. And that makes them feel good in the moment. But it doesn't necessarily set up your brain to think about the long term. And so in terms of the episodic, there's a lot of different ways to look at it. I mean, Mr. Trump, he lives in the angry moment, in the angry episode, but there are other people who have a much more sort of benevolent approach to life, who still go moment by moment, but aren't fighting all the time. And in some instances, that could be a positive sort of psychological development for some people. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag as to what the episodic approach to life brings you. I do think, though, that Mr. Trump is extraordinary in just how short-term he is. I mean, at least with respect to a public figure.
Mhm. Another question, what do you feel is contingency's role in relation to the plague of anxiety? If anxiety is this internal, undesired response to unknown circumstances, how does that play out as a dialectic with COVID, with its manic, viral, and anxiety-like activity? Can either anxiety or COVID be seen as a worse plague?
So could you repeat the last part of that? I'm not
Yeah.
sure I got the last part of it.
It says, if anxiety is this internal undesired response to unknown circumstances, how does that play out as a dialectic with COVID, with its manic, viral, and anxiety-like activity? Can anxiety or COVID be seen as a worse plague?
Well, there's a lot of interest in psychology in the conception of anxiety and, like, what is the root of anxiety? Why do we feel anxious? And I think the general view today is that anxiety is something that's mainly associated with conflict and uncertainty. And so, we've evolved to be social creatures who live together in groups, but when we can't predict what's going to happen in those groups, we don't know if we're going to be accepted or empowered in the group, then we feel anxiety. The virus just brings in a whole different dimension to all of this, I think. I think for many of us, when we are feeling uncertainty and anxiety, we have the strong urge to bond with other people, to connect up, to find social support. And yet that's in some ways the worst thing you can do under the aegis of the virus. I mean, we're alone, although together, but alone. And so the kinds of social settings, I think, that have helped us relieve anxiety in the past are not available to many of us, or if they are, they're available through Zoom or something like that. So I think that's one kind of way to think about it. I'm not sure I get the idea on the dialectic. I'm not quite following that idea there. But I do think anxiety, and its link to uncertainty, is something that's well established in psychology. And this era that we're living in right now is sort of showing that on steroids. And yet at the same time, we don't have the coping mechanisms at our disposal, I think, most of us, to deal with this particular kind of situation, which makes us even more fearful and more anxious and leads to more uncertainty.
Mm-hmm. So are you thinking, like, the situation we are in right now, where a lot of people are thinking, like, we are all in the same situation, even though we probably would agree this is not the case. Is that more helpful? Like, do people feel solidarity, less anxious because we know we are kind of in similar situations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, in the plague, it's not clear that the pestilence brings people together. I mean, in many ways, it in the novel, it drives people apart in certain situations. And it's hard to know how this is playing out. There's so, like, if you watch television here in the United States, I mean, it's incredible how the commercials have changed in the last 3 weeks or so. And, every product out there is advertising itself in this kind of redemptive, feel-good manner. And, talking about how, we're all alone, but we're together in this. But, that's heartwarming. But is it true? I mean, I think a lot of people are suffering, and we don't know how it's happening. I mean, for example, there is some indication that domestic abuse has gone way up during this particular period. People are stuck in the house with each other, and bad things are happening within the house. Crime is down outside the house, but in the house, there's more conflict and so forth. So, but a lot of that is kind of hidden. It's out of view. And so it's just really hard to know if people are feeling together or not. And also, it's just so early. This is so early. That's another thing in the plague. There's a priest in the novel gives a sermon early on in the novel, and one of the characters says, sermons, they come out. There's a lot of rhetoric at the beginning of a plague and at the end. Okay, but in the middle, in the long middle, there isn't a lot of rhetoric. There isn't a lot you can say. So I feel we're in the beginning, and I don't know how we'll be talking about this. And if 6 months from now, 4 months from now, and will we feel alone together? I mean, it's just really hard to predict, I think.
Thank you. Mark Freeman says, great talk, Dan. Thank you. Even though Trump may be the quintessential episodic man, he tends to portray himself as the gifted hero. So narratively empty though he may be, he's able, through his messianic rhetoric, to portray himself as a redeemer. This seems like a particularly dangerous mix, leading to an utterly false messiah who poisons rather than redeems, and radical denial to the mix. And it seems that much more dangerous and volatile. Thoughts about this version of things?
Well, as usual, Mark Freeman says it just right, because he always does. I mean, he's right. I think with respect to Trump, it is sort of interesting. Trump doesn't think about his life long term. He doesn't think about the United States or the world long term, but his supporters do, some of them. And the Make America Great idea, the slogan for his campaign, does evoke a redemptive narrative of sorts. It says, once upon a time, America was great, long ago. And then it wasn't great because bad things happened to it, mainly other countries and also liberals, and bad people messed it up. And now we have to restore the golden age. We have to bring back what we lost. So there is a kind of story there, I guess. It's a paradise lost kind of story, and an effort to rekindle and bring back this golden era. And that kind of narrative of restoration is not unusual in political rhetoric. It is often associated with more conservative or right-wing kind of approaches that try to bring back a golden age and so forth. I don't think Trump really kind of even gets that part. He just has this gut sense that people like this idea of making America great again, but he's not really thinking about what that would involve going forward. He doesn't really have a narrative understanding of it. But as Mark suggests, many people who support him do have a long-term narrative in mind. So for example, many evangelical Christians in this country, especially white evangelical Christians, vote for Trump. They're among his strongest supporters, and they see him, some of them, as a vehicle for a positive transformation of the world. I mean, he's part of God's plan. He's bringing, a new age to a new kind of epoch of Christianity to America. He's restoring America's great Christian roots. Maybe he's even signaling the end times. I mean, there's these real weird messianic kind of things going on. And as Mark says, I mean, it's an extraordinarily dangerous and toxic kind of thing. And when you have that kind of story and you put it all on this one guy, he is like the Messiah. And so what happens if he loses the election in 2020? He may not leave. I mean, we could have a constitutional crisis on our hands. And if he does leave, there will be millions of Americans who are so disgruntled because they will feel that they have been robbed, that the Messiah has been taken away from them. And it's just not a pretty picture. And the whole COVID-19 crisis, I mean, it complicates it even more now. I mean, on the one hand, you see just how ineffectual our government is. And we're a disgrace to the country, to the world in terms of how we've handled this virus on the one hand, and Trump has gotten a lot of blame. On the other hand, his supporters, they're doubling down. They're not going away.
Thank you. Gordana's asking, you argued for radical acceptance. Even though you said you did not mean accepting the status quo, acceptance is the opposite of change. That is, if demands for radical change. Can injustice or inequality be removed if the desired approach is radical acceptance? More generally, how the framework of radical acceptance can conceptualize unacceptable inequality or discrimination. May I quote Martin Luther King, "I'm proud to be maladjusted."
Yeah. Well, let me also quote Martin Luther King Jr. in another way, where he quoted somebody else when he said, he imagined the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And that is a very powerfully redemptive narrative. And it's a narrative that I feel is very inspiring. I did not mean to suggest that stories of acceptance necessarily work against a redemptive view of the world. I think, we want to kind of mix them a little bit. The value of an acceptance perspective, in my mind, is that it is very clear-eyed. It doesn't look away. It focuses on the suffering. And it tells us we can't look away. We have to understand what's going on right now, and we have to feel it, and we have to have empathy for others. And we can't just gloss over this and see this as, well, it's bad, but we're going to get through this and it's going to be great way down the road. I mean, you don't want simple redemption that way. And I think that's Dr. Ryu's message at the end of The Plague. I mean, he's very happy. Things have changed. The citizens are safe now, and he celebrates with the citizens, but he knows that this is going to be back. There will be other pestilences, that there will always be adversities and obstacles. And in some cases, we won't be able to overcome them. And so I don't want to suggest that acceptance means just, kind of going along with that. I think, Dr. Ryu, he never gives up. He fights all the time. He's constantly out there. And I think we should do that. But we also have to be clear-eyed about this and kind of understand that no matter how strong our ideals, we're still dealing with the real world here. So I think that question's really good. I respect that concern. And I think there's some sort of kind of dialectic here between acceptance and resistance. And I think you can actually do both. I mean, I think in some ways, to be an effective resistance against the status quo, you have to see the world for what it is. You have to, in some way or another, accept what's going on out there in a clear-eyed way, and then work to make change. And of course, we hope you do make positive change, but it doesn't always work.
So do you think maybe that kind of resistance could be part of generativity and therefore kind of linked with the redemptive self?
Yeah, well, generativity is a big deal in this, and I don't talk too much about it in the talk, but I mean, my whole interest in redemptive life narratives, I mean, I've spent 2 decades studying redemptive stories, my main interest is that these are the kinds of narratives that highly generative midlife adults, at least in the United States, tend to tell about their lives. And I think these are admirable stories that motivate generativity and focus people on trying to make a positive difference for the next generation. And so I celebrate those stories. I affirm those stories. I think those stories are really good. One of the things, just to contrast that with Mr. Trump and the episodic approach, there's so many weird things about Trump. I mean, it's mind-boggling, but one of the weirdest things about him is that unlike any president in my memory, he never talks about the next generation. He never invokes a kind of generativity rhetoric. He never says, you know, people will look back on this day someday, and our children and our children's children, you know, will benefit them. He doesn't think that way. He's too much in the moment. Redemptive stories, I think, are powerful in part because they orient us towards the future and improving the future and making the world a better place for our children and our grandchildren. So I find those to be very inspiring stories. I do think, though, during a time of plague right now, we have to kind of sometimes interrogate those redemptive stories a little bit and start to see how maybe, you know, they're not the be all and end all. There are other kinds of narrative ways to think about the situation we're in right now. And I think Dr. Ryu manages to do that pretty well in the plague.
Constanza says, thank you so much, Dr. McAdams, for an outstanding talk. As a fellow humanoid, I was truly happy to hear you talk about narrative identity, and I immediately connected this to Paul Ricoeur. I was wondering, since you mentioned nurses in your section about redemption, whether you're planning to conduct qualitative research with essential workers, participants in the future, including but not extensive to nurses, doctors, grocery store clerks, etc.
I hadn't thought about doing that, but I think that's a good idea. My daughter is a nurse, and she's my younger daughter, and she's was on the front lines in San Francisco, Oakland. I'm very proud of her. I do think that kind of work will need to be done. I suspect there'll be, I mean, maybe some of my students, maybe will get involved, maybe some of the people in the audience might want to like pursue those kind of inquiries going forward. I'm very happy that your questioner mentioned Paul Ricoeur, moreover. In psychology, kind of where I hang out, there isn't a lot of recognition of where these ideas about narrative identity came from. And Paul Ricoeur is one of the great pioneers in that sense. I know Mark Freeman has written about this as well. Mark's been very influenced by Paul Ricoeur, but a lot of psychologists don't know about him, at least the ones who do research and publish in the journals, and his profound musings and writings on time and narrative and so forth. And the idea that, you know, human beings make narrative sense through time, make sense of time through narrative. So yeah, I mean, I think qualitative work focusing on the phenomenological experience of this time, how nurses and first responders and many others who are part of the COVID drama later talk about what they went through, how they talk about it now, how they'll talk about it later. How will we make sense of this moment going forward in history? These are huge questions. I mean, this is the biggest crisis that certainly has faced humankind in my lifetime, surely. You know, it's difficult to predict where it will go, and it's also difficult to predict what kind of stories people will create about this and how they will make sense of this going forward. But for sure, people will tell stories, and there will be a lot of meaning made.
Absolutely. I was thinking when you were talking about in your presentation at the beginning about the life story interview, I was wondering how and where, like in 10 years from now, this COVID-19 crisis and the lockdown would pop up, like in what parts of the life story interview, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have in our life story interviews, especially with the ones we do with late midlife adults, we're very interested in how they sort of make sense of big world events from their past. And so, you know, that might be something like 9/11 or the Vietnam War, or, you know, in the US, the John F. Kennedy assassination. I mean, these are like benchmark moments. And you know, we asked them about that, and they have some interesting things to say, but it's not that common that people bring these events spontaneously into the overall narration of their lives, unless we ask them to. But for COVID-19, I don't see how people wouldn't bring, it seems like there's going to be the world before COVID-19, there's the world after, hopefully, COVID-19. And that's going to be a demarcation in the lives of many people. And it's going to make for a dramatic shift in the story from one chapter to the next, a dividing line that just about everybody will have some strong reaction to.
Antonia Irene says, thanks for the talk. What is the role of history in the narrative-oriented approach to crisis? It seems that you emphasize the projection into the future, but how about the role of the distant past?
Yeah. Well, ideally, and by the way, you can think of the distant past in two ways. I mean, you can think of it in terms of history with a capital H, and that is to say, history as humankind has known it and constructed it. And then you can also talk about small personal history, like a person's own past and how they make sense of it. And in our research, we mainly focus on that latter meaning. But in both instances, I mean, it would seem to me that the value of history, whether it's broad or personal, is that it might provide guidelines. It might provide lessons. It might provide insights. I mean, we learn, hopefully, from history. It's not like we wake up unless you're Donald Trump, you don't wake up every day with a new world. I mean, you've got a past and you're making sense of it. So we hope we learn from history. Indeed, with respect to COVID, I mean, there's a lot been written recently, things I didn't know about, the flu epidemic back in 1919, 1920, that just ran through Europe and North America and other places too. And so, scientists have studied that. They're learning things from that. But I think in terms of individual lives, it always helps to put things in a historical perspective and try to understand how people like us have coped before. And maybe we can learn something from that. I do think people do that with their own lives. I mean, this is very common in our life story interviews where people will talk about a challenge that they face right now or going forward, and they'll say, it reminds me a little bit of what happened to me when I was 10. And, I learned something back then. Maybe I'll be able to pull that idea forward and use it in a positive way as my life moves ahead. And so history, either capital H or small h, is always fundamental here when it comes to the narrative understanding of lives and the narrative understanding of life.
Mark is asking, regarding acceptance, looking at reality squarely and so on, what happens in those situations, like this current one, when we really don't know what's going on, when reality is being corrupted and contested?
Yeah. Well, I think you have to, first of all, know what Mark knows, and that is that what you see isn't necessarily the whole thing, but it's something. And so you try to understand, try to perceive reality from as many different perspectives as you can. It is more and more difficult, though, given how polarized, at least in our country, the news is. I mean, this is just such a weird thing where, Republicans and Democrats see the virus through different lenses, I mean, they have kind of there's different understandings of it. Now that has closed somewhat. I mean, they're starting to come together a little bit more, but it's still, sort of weird that, something like it seems objective, like a pandemic, would be politicized the way it's been politicized here. So yeah, I think acceptance is not a real easy thing. I'm even wondering if that's the right word, acceptance. There might be a better term here. But what I'm imagining is a kind of scrutinizing of the world. You're observing, you're a keen observer. You're trying to understand stuff, see things from different perspectives, realizing that maybe, you're an imperfect observer, you won't know it all, but you're still sort of hell-bent on trying to make as much sense of it as you can. You're flexible, you're open to possibilities. That sounds trite, but I think that's the best I can do with that good question.
Thank you. Carlos is asking, Oh, Mark is saying radical attention.
That's pretty good. I got to think about that. I'll email him.
Carlos is asking, in the notion of having a different type of world before and after COVID-19, is this notion a redemptive story or a radical acceptance story?
Yeah. Well, I think in the long run, what I certainly hope for, and I think what many people, regardless of their ideological persuasion, want, is a long-term redemptive meaning. I mean, it would be great if 10 years from now, we look back and we see how something positive came out of what so far has been a really bad thing. And I suspect there will be something like that, but you just, you don't know. I mean, certain things happen in history for which it's very difficult to make redemptive meaning. Just the classic example that's brought out always is the Holocaust in World War II. Okay, so 6 million died in the Holocaust, and so sure, from certain perspectives, maybe some positive things may have come out of that. But I mean, do we want to make that part of a redemptive story? I think that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to do. In the US, slavery in the 19th century, I mean, it was a horrible thing. Sure, we got through it. And for the last 150 years, we've been, on a kind of civil rights move. And as I believe Martin Luther King, when he says that, that it does bend towards justice in the long run. But many observers, especially African-American observers like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's a very prominent African-American scholar here in the US, they resist these redemptive stories about history. They don't like this idea that the deaths and the oppression of the 19th century are in some way part of this grand redemptive narrative. It doesn't do justice to the suffering. And so I think in those instances, I mean, there's some, what Coates is sort of saying is we're not being clear-eyed enough. We're sugarcoating, we're glossing over the really horrible things, and we can't do that. And yet, in a redemptive story, you want it to get better. So, there's this urge to make it better. We got to get to the good stuff down the road. So this is a real tension here. You don't want to gloss over the negative. At the same time, you don't want to wallow in it for the rest of your life. You don't want to ruminate yourself to death.
And I think the following question, and I would say this is the last question for today, fits kind of nicely there. Have you found any interesting effects from COVID on people's narratives with respect to narcissism? For example, people presenting their personal narratives as more grandiose than they might have been in order to cope.
Right. Well, I suspect that's happening. I mean, I don't have any direct knowledge of it. I haven't really been doing any systematic research over the past 2 months on those kinds of things. But I was just reading a piece, I think in the New York Times today, maybe it was yesterday, about the proliferation of memoirs and personal stories about going through COVID. There was one written by a prominent Chinese author who lives in Wuhan, and she has published her memoir of getting through that period from December up through March in Wuhan, China, and that's already been translated and people are reading it worldwide. But that's just the beginning. I mean, there's going to be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of these accounts out there, and some of them will be really powerful, right? But some won't, and we'll have to see how that plays out. But in terms of the narcissism piece, yeah, I think there is. You can sort of see how this might feed that a little bit. I mean, again, it's a tension because you don't want people to kind of give up in the face of the virus and say, oh, I'm a victim. You want them to fight. You want them to, in a clear-eyed way, you want them to persevere. So there's a heroism in that. But I suppose it could shade into narcissism when you have the belief that, my story, what I've been through here is so unique and so much more dramatic and so much more powerful and meaningful than anything that anybody else could say about it. And so then you have a kind of, competition of victimhood there, which can be sort of problematic, I guess. But still, I mean, for the most part, when people writing memoirs, even if they're the only ones reading them, it's a good thing, I think. I mean, we need to narrate these things. This is a really powerfully difficult period in our lives for many of us, maybe all of us. And if those kind of activities help, and I think the research suggests that they do, narrating your experience really helps people to work through it, then, it's hard not to support it.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk and a very inspiring discussion. I think we all will continue thinking about the radical acceptance or radical attention, and there's even more suggestions coming in. So I would like to invite you to discuss that further on our Slack channel, the conference channel. I will post all the questions we didn't have time to talk about there. Thank you so much, Dan McAdams, again, for joining us today and for discussing with us. And thanks to everyone else.
Yeah, thank you, Irene. Thank you all out there, even though I can't see you. Thank you very much. It's great.
Thank you.